Top Indian Air Force commanders launched an in-depth review of India's air defense system at a three-day conference beginning today, following the border row with China in eastern Ladakh. A few days ago, India's Navy took part in a joint military exercises with the U.S. in the Indian Ocean. Meanwhile, New Delhi is also considering a ban on Chinese tech company Huawei to exclude it from the country's 5G networks. So, is India determined to contain China's influence in Indo-Pacific, both strategically and economically? And has Asia's second-largest economy abandoned the history of strategic autonomy to favor Washington over Beijing? How will China handle the relationship? To answer these questions, I'm joined today by Huang Jing, Dean of the Institute of International and Regional Studies at the Beijing Language and Culture University, Ambassador Rajiv Bhatia, Distinguished Fellow at Gateway House, and later in the second half by Ernest McDuffie, founder of Global McDuffie Group. That is our topic. This is Dialogue. I'm Zhou Yue. Ambassador Bhatia, about the three-day conference of the Indian Air Force, is this focused on Indian-China border?
Thank you very much for inviting me to this show. This is a wonderful opportunity to interact with my friends in China and across the world. To answer your question, I think we have to appreciate that the Air Force Commanders Conference is a periodic development, a periodic conference here in India. The importance to this conference is certainly given by the context in which it is taking place. And I think it's very important for us to remember that context. This is the hard summer of 2020. We are sitting in middle of July. Just a month back, on 15th June, there was a very serious and bloody clash on India-China border. This has created a whole set of negative sentiments. Former senior officials have called it the end of a chapter in India-China relations, and therefore we should remember that the discussions in the government these days, as far as we can see, based on my scholarly perspective, as you know, I don't speak for a government, do indicate that they need to focus on the recent developments in the recent context.
And is this India's response to what China has been doing along the border? Because it seems that since that standoff, as you mentioned in June, the situation has calmed down. Is it?
It is definitely a very complex situation. It actually started earlier. It started in May. The whole of May there were what we call face-off incidents. And then there was this violent clash on 15 June. And since then, of course, there have been a series of discussions at the level of military commanders and also at the working level of diplomats. Certain understandings and agreements have been reached, which is a positive thing, which is a good thing. Essentially, the agreement is to disengage and to de-escalate the situation in every possible manner. But seeing it from Delhi, it seems that this process is taking a very long time. It seems to us in Delhi that the decisions taken on the Chinese side are, in the process of getting implemented, but they have not been fully implemented yet. And therefore, I think it would be accurate to say that while the tensions of mid-June are probably not as palpable today as they were then, but we have not yet resolved the situation.
And Mr. Huang Jing, what do you make of the current situation along the border? And is Indian military trying to flex muscles right now by having an air commanders meeting?
First, I don't think this air commanders meeting is to show kind of muscle. So this is a conference, like Ambassador just said, is a periodical conference. It may have some discussion about Indian-China conflict, but I think that's not only focus, because Indian Air Force have a lot of things to handle, first. And second, I also agree with Ambassador that the situation has come down, largely thanks to the a very reasonable and moderate approach of both governments. We know that the ministers of China and the minister of India has a phone conversation, which resulted in a very positive situation, which both sides has tried to escalate. That's a good situation. So I think that this kind of situation, this kind of event, is not the first time between China and India over the border. I don't think it will be the last time. But the issue here is not, of course, if we can stop all of it, that's fine. But if not, first and foremost is to prevent escalation. And second, I do believe there is a mechanism of crisis management, which, as we can see this time, that will prevent this kind of, conflict, small conflict, escalating into a massive confrontation. In that regard, I think the situation has been better. I do not believe this will lead to a long time, confrontation between two major powers in Asia. I don't think that serves the interest of neither country.
But Ambassador, militarily, the Indian Air Force is to induct its first batch of French-made Rafale fighter jets later this month, and this is being played up by the media in India. Is this an effort to try to balance between the Indian Air Force and the Chinese PLA?
Look, I'm not a defense expert. I'm a former diplomat, now working as a scholar. But with that perspective, I should point out that the purchase of Rafale and the advent of Rafale into the Indian Air Force is part of a long process. It is not triggered by the border clash, which I referred to. And I would like also to highlight here, while I do agree partially with my Chinese colleague, Professor, when he said that there is a relative calming down. But again, I stress that the situation has not been resolved. And I should also highlight that the assertiveness and this business of the killing of 20 soldiers on 15-16 June night has created a wave of negative sentiments across India. I think that should be taken into account.
But the problem is, how can we prevent that from happening? The Chinese maintain that if the Indians did not cross the line of control, the killings would not have happened. While the Indians said, even if there is some crossing, there shouldn't be casualties of life. Where should we...
That is...
Yes?
That is not the Indian position. I think, with due respect to you, the Indian position essentially is that there's been multiple transgressions across the line of actual control.
What do you mean by multiple transgression?
Yes, I mean at multiple points, and as a result, the situation became very serious. And then, what about the set of agreements and protocols which were in operation since 1993 or even earlier, which essentially forbade the use of arms by the soldiers of the two sides. Violating that, one side used, really primitive, brutal weapons to kill. Now, this is something which is taking place for the first time in the history of India-China relations, as I mentioned, in past 45 years. Something of this kind not happened. So I'm just stressing the gravity and underlining the need to resolve the border situation as early as possible.
Okay.
That's all.
Mr. Huang, the use of arms.
Yeah, I think the first and foremost that the line of actual control is not a thin line. It's a wire. It could be like a couple of miles wide. So it is very difficult to pin down which side cross line. And second, the line of so-called line of actual control has different explanations. India has the Indian side line of actual control and the China side. So therefore, to say who crossed the line of actual control is what you said, I said, is very difficult. But one thing I want to mention is that Prime Minister Modi said in public, said no Indian land has been invaded. He says this repeatedly, which means the accusations that Chinese troops invaded India simply does not hold water, because Prime Minister Modi himself said that no Indian land has been invaded. Further, second, in this clash, no weapons being used, that's for sure. But why some casualties? Let's mention that majority of Indian soldiers being killed, died in the accident, is not killed. It's actually they're being injured because the Indian side cannot save them, cannot rescue them on time. So they stay in that high land, high latitude, in a very cold night. They've been injured, and then because they cannot be rescued, so they died because of that. It's not that the Chinese soldiers kill them on the spot. No, they'll be injured. For the same reason, China side has many soldiers being injured. But for whatever reason, the logistic arrangement on China side is good enough. They can rescue soldiers. But Indian side, for whatever reason, they cannot rescue their soldiers.
Let's move on from
the major reason for a lot of casualties.
Let's move on from the border clash to the repercussions.
Allow me 30 seconds.
Yes.
Just 30
yes,
seconds
Ambassador.
To make a brief comment as you guessed here. The first point to note is that India respects its martyrs. When we lost these 20 uniformed people, we felt very sad, but we felt deep respect for them. We do not know how many people you lost, because you keep it rather confidential information. It is your privilege. But we do know that when human lives are lost in a meaningless border confrontation, it is a sad thing for the relationship. And I thank you very much, my colleague, Professor, to quote Prime Minister Modi. I think he has also, I'm sure, heard Prime Minister Modi's very loud and clear call in his speech from Leh, when he said that the age of expansionism is over and the age of development is where we live in. So I do hope that we can draw lessons from it and try to bring ourselves back to normalcy, peace and tranquility.
Let's talk about the repercussions, gentlemen. The border clash obviously has led to widespread negative sentiment, probably on both sides, and demonstrations in India. There is a strong demonstration of anti-Chinese sentiment, probably because they're hearing the news of the casualties. The Chinese side didn't announce the casualty number, probably considering that might also fuel the nationalistic sentiment here in China. So is this kind of repercussions something we should expect to see? Is it constructive for the relationship between the two neighbors? Ambassador?
Yeah, thank you very much. It's a question really you should put to my Chinese friend, because the scene from Delhi, this whole series of episodes were created by the Chinese side, unfortunately. And therefore, this negative sentiment is what now you have to address. It is strong, it is across the country, it is reflected in the calls with regard to the Chinese goods and in many other developments. I think it is not good for the relationship, and that is why there is this talk for India-China relationship to be reviewed, to be reset, to note that the old chapter is ended. So I speak as somebody who is disappointed, who is sad, and who is concerned about the southward movement of relationship.
Yes,
Mr.
I
Huang?
agree. Yes, I agree. I think this is a great tragedy with life lost in some kind of meaningless way, and this should not have happened in the first place. But as I said that, I also noticed that there's a border issue. It's not just an issue in a bilateral relationship. It's also a very important issue in the internal politics, because this so-called border between China and India was not drawn by Indians, neither by the Chinese. It was drawn by the British. So therefore, it's deeply harbored a great national resentment in both Chinese and Indian people's mind, because the Indians have suffered 100 years of British Raj, and China also started to suffer the so-called 100 years of humiliation and injustice starting from 1840, the Opium War. So as a result, any reasonable compromise, it seems reasonable compromise between two countries on the border issue could backlash at home, could provoke, could stir up this kind of very strong national resentment against the colonialism and the imperialism. That's why both sides, both leadership has to be very careful to manage the border issue. This is the issue, as I argued many, many times. This is the issue of management, not a solution in the short future, in the near future. So as a result, both sides has to hold themselves, to constrain themselves, not to let things like this happen. But again, unfortunately, both sides accuse the other side. The Chinese accuse Indians, and equally Indians accuse the Chinese to cross the line. So how to prevent these things happen? I think both sides has to be very careful to work out a mechanism, first and foremost, to manage things like this, so that a tragedy like this will not happen.
What do you think the leaders of both countries should do? Obviously, they have own domestic politics to worry about. For example, Congress Party leader Rahul Gandhi accused the Modi government of being soft on the border issue. When people are expecting people to not add fuel to the fire, the domestic politics is not helpful.
I think that it's started not by what people should do, but by people what should not do.
Let us not talk over each other. First. Mr. Huang first, and then Ambassador. Mr. Huang?
Yes, I think, as I said many, many times, on a situation like this, I think both leaders should work out a no-do list. What things we should not do in the first place. For example, we should not fire a gunshot. In other words, the hard weapon, the hard war should not be started. Nobody should first fire armed weapons first. Secondly, we can work out that no one should accuse unilaterally the other side before the situation is cleared. Last but not the least, both sides should agree that we should work out on each spot where is the actual line of control really is, and neither side should not cross the line, or maybe even better, both sides should withdraw from this line, like, for example, 5 miles from the line. If we work out the list of not to do, then it's much easier and clear for us to work out a to-do list.
Ambassador?
Let me
remind
the esteemed professor, that there is, very easy to remind the past and the history of past and various versions of the past history. But let me remind him that we are today in the year 2020, and we are bearing the burden of guiding and helping, not guiding, but helping our nations to face the future. Now, in that light, already our leaders have done what they were required to do. They signed the agreements, but those agreements have been violated. Then our present leaders have very clearly given the guidelines, which is that differences should not become disputes. But now look at the tragedy. Disputes are actually becoming violent disputes. So essentially, I think, if you're looking for a solution, rather than just a long, endless debate on the fine complexities of borders, for which you should really call the border experts to debate them in front of you, I think it is important for all of us to focus on what is the way out. You keep talking about, some of the developments at home. Let me assure you, I think I want to do it very briefly and very clearly. India is one nation. India has one foreign policy, and that is run from South Block in New Delhi, where the Prime Minister's office is located, where the Ministry of Foreign Affairs and Ministry of Defense are located. Other ministries are in the neighborhood. And it is this foreign policy that my esteemed professor and his colleagues should study. India wants to be friends, but India is committed to protect its national interest. And if China has core interests, so have the other countries. Certainly India too has core interests.
Ambassador, about foreign policy,
demands.
The Indians recently held a joint military exercise with Americans of Andaman and Nicobar Islands. Of course, this is an annual drill, but people are probably reading between the lines. Is this targeted at China?
Again, our research would show that the naval exercises involving Indian and American navies is part of a pattern. This is not the first time they are taking place. There are two new things. One is, of course, the context, which I have already pointed out. It is not just Galwan Valley clash, but also the larger issue of developments happening around China, particularly in the South China Sea. And we know about the freedom of operations by the Americans. But the other new thing was that in these waters, in the Andaman Sea waters, it was for the first time that we saw an American aircraft carrier. The last time it was there, it was in 1971, when it was there to threaten India. So I think China really needs to ponder seriously as to what has happened between then and now. What exactly is the reason behind this kind of change, a sea change in the situation today.
All right. Thank you, Ambassador. Thank you for your intake. Well, Mr. Huang, just as Ambassador pointed out, what a sea change of global politics, geopolitics. And last month, India and Australia signed military agreements granting each other access to their military bases. And Australia is also considering joining the Indian, U.S., Japan trilateral exercise. So are we seeing a united front against China in the periphery of this country?
I don't think so. I think first, India is a great country with a policy of independence, independent foreign policy, and non-assignment. It's long-time principle India's foreign policy. I agree with the ambassador that the relationship between China and India is very, very important. If we want to make an Asian dream come true, the two countries have to work with each other, has to overcome the issues like border conflict. As an independent country, India has every right to do military exercise with any other countries, United States, Japan, Australia, if it serves India's interests. But China's position is also very clear. This military exercise should not target China. I don't see any evidence that such naval joint exercise is against China. So China said should not be oversensitive about this.
Okay.
And it is not productive at all. We should respect Indians' right to do things like this. But meanwhile, we also should work very hard to improve relationship between India and China because it serves each other's good interest. On this part, I do agree with Ambassador just now. I think we're on the same line.
All right. We have also collected some opinions on the internet from social media users have been talking a lot about what is happening between China and India and what it means for the rest of the world. Praveen Soni said, U.S. struggling to come to terms with China's new major country relationship. Simplified, U.S. needs India to balance China, not fight its wars with PLA. India to wake up and know U.S. strategic comfort will diminish with China in South Asia. So reset bilateral ties with China. So do you think it is a correct reading of the trilateral relationship between U.S., India, and China?
You're asking me?
Yes, Mr. Huang.
Yes. I think that for the United States, of course, the United States work very hard to try to, put India to its side. It's a so-called strategic competition between the United States and China. But so far, I cannot say there's any evidence India is taking that line. Instead, I say India still insist on its non-assignment policy because it does not work for India's interest to be China's enemy. And vice versa, for China too, it does not work for China's interest to push India over. So in that regard, I think both China and India, two largest countries in Asia, should work for its own national interests. And I do not believe a kind of so-called alliance between India and the United States work for India's interest. Of course, not China's interest at all. So in that regard, this trilateral relationship should be, I think, two pairs of bilateral relationship independent of each other. India will not intervene into relationship between China and the United States. For the same reason, China should not and will not intervene in the bilateral relationship between China or between India and the United States. Both sides respect the other side's decision in terms of foreign policy.
And now we have Ernest McDuffie joining us in the discussions. Let's talk about the economic aspect of this. So, Mr. McDuffie, India is considering a ban on Huawei, and the wealthiest man in India, Mukesh Ambani, announced last week that his company has developed a homegrown 5G solution from scratch. What do you make of what is happening in the tech field?
So it appears that India is making significant progress in 5G. There actually have been reports of planned investments from companies like Google and Facebook into India's 5G effort. So I think that's a positive step. Certainly the economics of the two largest countries by population in Asia should be aligned, and certainly there should be bilateral agreements and even trilateral agreements.
But now it is being taken hostage by the political distrust.
Yeah, that's absolutely true. I think you have to look at what's happened in the United States over the last 3.5 years or so as an anomaly, not really reflective of what the true best practices, the true future goals of the country will be. I think you're going to see a major change in the political atmosphere globally vis-a-vis the United States after this next national election.
What do you think should be India's wisest choice in terms of economic strategy? Is it divulging itself from its China exposure?
Well, I think that India needs to, focus internally. I think they're doing the right thing. This idea that Huawei is some kind of a bad actor, I think, is still in dispute. I haven't seen any concrete evidence. Of course, I wouldn't. I'm not in that, I'm not in that security area. But it's hard for me to imagine that an international company like Huawei is actually participating in, these kind of security shenanigans. So hopefully, the more transparency that companies provide to the global community will lead to us getting beyond these kind of political gamesmanship.
But Mr. Huang, if the Indians have security concerns about Huawei, what gets people confused is that ByteDance app, TikTok, is also banned in India. It is just an entertainment application, and they follow the Americans to ban TikTok in India, which is hugely loved by the young people there.
No, I think first and foremost, in my view, this is a political decision, not an economic decision. Because just as we discussed,
but it will have economic consequences.
Yes, let me finish. Has created enormous resentment at home. So Indian government has to do something to appease this kind of resentment. Economically speaking, I don't think it's wise, because we know that the high technology, especially given today's global economy, you need cooperation, not this kind of isolation. Isolation is not the way to work, because the globalization, economically speaking, is a result of our effort, joint effort, to optimize our productivities. So if economically speaking, this kind of ban of so-called Chinese APs in India is absolutely, to me, does not make any sense at all. But for the political decision, I can understand it.
But do you think India will have second thoughts and change course?
I think in the long run, I still expect that India and China can work together on 5G or other high-techs, because that's the best way for two countries. But how to work together, of course, that's another issue.
All right, we're running out of time. Thank you very much, Mr. Huang, and thank you, Mr. McDuffie. You've been watching Dialogue here on CGTN. I'm Zhu in Beijing. Thank you so much for watching. Goodbye.